A Blurring Line, Chapter 8, The Castle of Fyrien. Morgana was beginning to get frustrated. Ever since learning she was Uther's daughter after her fall down the stairs, though he'd never intended for her to know, nor was he aware she knew, she was redoubling her efforts. Targeting Arthur should have been easy. And yet, at every turn, he evaded and escaped her. She could pinpoint the problem, too, because only one person in the city knew she was working against Camelot. She had yet to tell anyone. She was a bit smarter than Morgana had accounted for. But Morgana had yet to go to Uther either. If she did, Arthur would never forgive her. It was clear to her, if not to the king, that Arthur was head over heels for Merlin, and Morgana was no longer sure that he would side with her no matter what. Not after Merlin had vanished from the dungeons during that debacle with the goblin. No alarm had been sounded. At all. Not until Uther found out. But if Merlin were to vanish, well, a lot of their problems would be solved. She brought this up to Morgause one night, and her sister frowned. "You are wise, sister, but this venture may prove foolish, unless the prince brings her along on another of his misadventures." "Why? She often leaves the city to gather herbs for Gaius. Could she not simply vanish on one of these outings?" Morgana asked, pacing the clearing. "My men have been watching the comings and goings of Camelot, and unfortunately these days she is never alone. She is always in the company of one of Arthur's knights, usually Sir Leon. A knight's death will be investigated far deeper than the disappearance of a servant," Morgause pointed out. Morgana let out an exasperated huff. "Arthur is far too concerned with his servants these days anyway." She paused mid-stride. "What is it?" Morgause asked. Morgana's face blossomed into a grin. "Merlin may be too heavily protected in the castle, and have no one we can threaten outside of it. But she is not the only servant Arthur is close to," Morgana explained. "And she has someone outside of Camelot who should be reachable. Her brother is in Carlion working as a blacksmith, easy pickings for a few of Senred's men. You send a few agents into Camelot to take Gwen, and we use her to lure Arthur and Merlin out of the castle and take them out," Morgana said, resuming her pacing. "You are brilliant, sister. I will contact you using the mirror I gave you for your birthday when we have her brother. What's his name?" "Elyan. I do not know him well, only that he left Camelot years ago to seek better prospects. And now he will be used to trap a prince," Morgause said, her smile deadly. Elyan had lived a pretty simple life since he left Camelot. He'd traveled from kingdom to kingdom, selling his sword and working in forges along the way. He had a decent setup in Carlion. That was until he'd been drugged by a few men who'd come into the forge without warning. He'd fought, crushed one of their legs with his hammer, but a dart to the neck had felled him, leaving him to wake in an unfamiliar dungeon. From what he understood, he was being used as leverage. His sister was the target of this scheme, and he had no idea why. Not until the matter was resolved, anyway. They were camping on the way back to Camelot when Gwen found the time to explain. Elyan had been used as bait to get Gwen to lure Arthur out of the castle. Gwen, though, had been smart enough to tell Arthur what was really happening, and he'd mounted a rescue mission. Elyan thought it had been a bit of a slapdash job, but it had succeeded, so who was he to question a prince's plan? He couldn't sleep, though. He had a choice to make: return to Camelot or go back to Carlion and hope he could avoid this happening again. It wasn't a pleasant prospect, but according to Gwen, no one had taken over their father's forge, and the lower town was hurting for a new blacksmith. He sighed. Turning, he looked over at his sister, sound asleep. He should have been around for her. He should have helped her through their father's death. He sighed. The sound of snapping twigs caught his attention. Only Gwen's friend Merlin was not here around the dying fire. She had gone off to find more wood. Elyan frowned and stood, stepping out into the trees. He wasn't far from the camp when a low voice caught his attention. "Don't move," He froze. That was Merlin's voice, and she sounded deadly calm. A flash of silver in the moonlight landed near his left foot, and Elyan winced. Looking down, he blinked. A black adder was laying just half a step away from him. In its head was buried a knife he'd spotted on Merlin's belt. He let out a breath as he looked up and spotted her. She was halfway across the clearing. "Nice throw," Elyan said, pulling her knife from the head of the snake. "Thanks. I have a good teacher," she said, gathering up her fallen wood. Elyan pulled a cloth from his pocket and cleaned her blade. Merlin stepped over to him and frowned, pausing as he turned to head back to the camp. "Do you hear that?" she asked, and Elyan frowned and stilled again, listening. He nearly jumped when Merlin shoved the wood into his hands and rushed towards the tree the adder had been next to. She returned with her hands cupped. In them was a tiny ball of gray feathers, hooting lowly. "Looks like the adder took out the rest of the nest," Merlin said, frowning at the baby owl. It wasn't much bigger than her palm, and she arranged her scarf, gently tucking the owl into it, so it was in a makeshift sling around her neck. It hooted once, looked up at her, then burrowed into the fabric and watched Elyan balefully. Merlin held out her arms for the wood. "I've got this," he said, and she grinned, following him back to camp. Elyan decided he would stay. Gwen needed him, and though he wouldn't like to admit it, he needed her as well. He quickly discovered Merlin's eccentricities were not relegated to simply rescuing baby birds. She seemed to be the exception to the majority of the rules. She sassed Arthur. She ran around town with several of the knights. She was the physician's apprentice. She was quite well liked in the lower town. From a few stories he heard at the tavern, Arthur had been insufferable before Merlin came along. Elyan wouldn't know. He'd never interacted with royalty before Merlin, Arthur, Morgana, and Gwen rescued him. Now, though, half the people who came to the forge were there because of a recommendation from Gwen or Merlin. So far, he'd met Sir Leon, who was the first knight of Camelot, and came in to get his sword repaired after a difficult fight. The blade had been knocked loose from the hilt, and Elyan had to reset it. It wasn't a very difficult fix, but the knight was quite pleased with it. A few days later, a younger knight, Sir Galahad, came in with a broken chain on his mace. That was even easier. What was difficult was when Arthur came in with a request. "Gwen says you do excellent detailed work," he said, and Elyan nodded. "I've heard that compliment before, sire." "I need you to make a necklace," he said, placing down a hunk of unworked gold. Elyan's eyebrow climbed. "I was hoping you could do something subtle with golden roses," he said, and Elyan nodded. "I'll have a sketch for your approval in a few days," he said, and Arthur nodded. "Oh, one more thing. Gwen can know, Merlin can't. Her birthday is coming up, and I want it to be a surprise," Arthur said, and Elyan grinned and nodded. Camelot was far more interesting than he remembered it being.